I think I should start from the very beginning. My name is Marietta, and I was born to Luigi and Paola. My parents were ordinary people, like millions of others. Or at least, that's what I thought when I was little. My father was always busy. He lived by his ideas, made plans, sought opportunities. Money, business, success, they were his constant companions. He would leave early and return late, smelling of expensive cologne, cigars, and the cold city air. My mother was different. Warm, like a sunny morning after a long rain. She worked as a teacher at a local school, where every child, even the one no one listened to, found a kind friend in her. She read me bedtime stories, baked chocolate cookies on weekends, and stroked my hair when I cried. The first 9 years of my life were peaceful. A house in the suburbs with a garden, a dusty road leading to school, summer trips to the sea. Just like everyone else. But one day, my world cracked. It was a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my room, arranging dolls around an imaginary table when I heard shouting. My parents' voices blended into a single stream, angry, broken, nothing like their usual arguments. I froze. My heart pounded, my breath caught. I walked down the stairs. My father stood in the middle of the living room, his face flushed, his hands flying in the air. My mother was crying. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in black trails. "How could you, Paola?" My father's voice was breaking. "Luigi." "I'm sorry," my mother's voice trembled. "With Elvise?" "He had dinner at our house." My father's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an answer to something he couldn't understand. "I didn't mean for this to happen," my mother sobbed. "It just happened." The world I knew was crumbling before my eyes. The weeks that followed were a blur. Evenings filled with silence. My parents hushed conversations behind closed doors. Whispers over the phone. Strangers in suits coming to our house. And then came the day when my father crouched down in front of me, took my hands in his, and said, "Marietta, we're leaving." His eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Why?" My voice shook. "It's complicated, sweetheart. But you're mother and I love you. That will never change." We left. My father took me to a new home, huge, bigger than the last. His business suddenly took off, and it seemed like our lives should have gotten better. But they didn't. He would leave before I woke up and return when I was already asleep. During the day, I stayed with my grandparents, Narciso and Deborah. Marietta, darling, helped me with the cookies. My grandmother would try to keep me occupied. My grandfather took me to the garden, taught me the names of flowers. They were kind, but they couldn't replace my parents. And when my father was home, "Did you finish your homework?" he would ask the moment he stepped inside. "There's a mess in your room. Clean up before dinner." He tried to be both mother and father at the same time, but he wasn't good at either. Still, I knew he was trying. Every Sunday became Father-Daughter Day. He spoke about it with a special pride, as if it were a sacred tradition no one could interfere with. We would go out together, and those were the rare moments when his attention belonged only to me. Mini-golf was his favorite. He played with such passion that, at times, he seemed like a completely different person, loud, competitive, unpredictable. "Watch out, Marietta. I'm going to make this shot in one go," he'd shout, swinging his club, and I couldn't help but laugh, even if I pretended not to be impressed. Sometimes we stopped for ice cream. I always ordered the same thing, triple chocolate fudge. "How can you eat that sugar bomb?" He would pretend to be disgusted, but every time, when he thought I wasn't looking, he would sneak a spoonful. Other times, we visited the local museum. My father would read every informational plaque aloud, giving each historical figure a different voice. Columbus crossed the ocean, he'd proclaim in a ridiculous pirate accent, making me giggle while other visitors shot us sideways glances. When I turned 10, my father signed me up for piano lessons. At first, I wasn't thrilled, but music turned out to be fascinating. I loved the feeling of my fingers gliding across the keys, turning sounds into melodies. My father attended every concert. He sat in the front row, grinning so wide it was almost funny. Even if I made mistakes, he was always the first to stand up and applaud, as if I had just won a Grammy. But even with all these good moments, I couldn't help but miss my mother. Sometimes, when my father worked late, I would take out old photo albums. In them, my mother smiled from every page. I traced her face with my finger, trying to remember the sound of her laughter, the scent of her perfume. Once a month, I got to see my mother. These scheduled visits felt like a holiday to me. I would circle them on the calendar, count down the days, waiting with both excitement and anxiety. The first time we met after the separation, it was unbearably awkward. We stood facing each other like strangers. Then my mother burst into tears and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. After that, our meetings became a whirlwind of events. It felt like she was trying to fit an entire month's worth of love into a single day. We went shopping, and she bought me clothes that made me feel grown up and cool. I remember trying on a cropped top and thinking, I look amazing. Oh my God, you look stunning, my mother squealed excitedly. When I wore it at home, my father nearly had a heart attack. Absolutely not, he said, his face turning red. Go change. I stomped off to my room, grumbling. Well, Mom said I could wear it. I'm not your mother, he replied calmly. At our next visit, my mom took me to a trendy cafe where the waiters wore bow ties. Order anything you want, sweetheart, she said with a smile. I went wild. Chocolate cake, ice cream with syrup, 3 different sodas. By the end of the day, I was so wired on sugar that I was practically bouncing in place. When I got home, my father watched me zooming around the living room and muttered, "What on earth did she feed you?" But the best day was our trip to Adventureland, an amusement park packed with dizzying rides. We rode every roller coaster twice, screaming and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Then we sat on a bench, sharing a giant ball of cotton candy. My mother gazed off into the distance, into the past. Do you remember how we used to have family picnics in the backyard? She asked softly. I nodded. Your dad always managed to burn the burgers, and we'd end up having ice cream for dinner, she added with a smile. I nodded again, a lump rising in my throat. Those memories felt distant, foreign, like I was watching an old movie where the main characters were strangers. My mother squeezed my hand. I miss those days, Marietta. I miss you. Maybe, one day, we can be a family again. My heart leapt. Really? I whispered, barely daring to hope. She smiled, but there was no spark in her eyes, the kind people have when they're telling the truth. We'll see each other, sweetheart. We'll see each other. For weeks, I lived on that hope. I imagined us being a family again. Having picnics in the backyard, going on trips, laughing by the fire. But then I'd look at my father, I'd see how hard he tried. How he struggled to make Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, even though they turned out awful. How he packed my school lunches but always forgot the salt. How he left little notes on the kitchen table, wishing me good morning. And I felt guilty for even thinking about leaving. Then, just before my 12th birthday, my mother announced that she was getting married. To Elvise. Yes, that Elvise. The wedding was like something out of a fairy tale. My mother looked stunning in her white dress, and Elvise beamed with happiness. I stood in my lilac bridesmaid dress, watching them exchange vows, feeling like I was being torn in two. Part of me was happy for my mother. She laughed in a way I hadn't seen in years. But the other part couldn't stop thinking about my father, alone in our big, empty house, probably buried in work or mindlessly flipping through TV channels. After the wedding, everything changed. Our visits took on a different tone. Alvise was always around, hovering in the background like an eager puppy. "I've always dreamed of having a daughter like you, Marietta," he said, ruffling my hair. It was sweet. Strange, but sweet. And my mother looked at him as if he had just given her the moon. And at some point, it seemed to me that maybe, just maybe, this whole tangled situation could actually work itself out. My mother started talking more and more about me living with them. "You'll have your own room. With a huge window, just like you always wanted." Her eyes sparkled. "We can paint the walls any color you like." I nodded and smiled, but deep inside, something twisted into a knot. I couldn't shake the feeling that even thinking about it was a betrayal of my father. Our shopping trips became less frequent. Instead, there were family dinners at their house. Alvise cooked, and, to be honest, he was pretty good at it, and then entertained us with stories about his work. My mother hung on to his every word, while I sat there, pushing food around my plate, feeling like an outsider in my own family. By the time I turned 14, everything started spinning even faster. My mother began calling me every week, sometimes more. She started showing up at my school events unannounced, bringing me flowers, treating me to ice cream. "You know, Marietta," she said one day, stirring her coffee, "you're old enough now to decide where you want to live. The courts will listen to you." Every time she said that, I froze. Part of me wanted to take the chance. To go back to the way things used to be. But another part wasn't so sure anymore. One day, my mother showed up at my debate club meeting. I was in the middle of arguing a point about climate change when I noticed her slipping into the back row of the audience. When it was over, she rushed to me, glowing with excitement. "Oh, Marietta, you were amazing," she exclaimed, grabbing my hands. And then, with that same shining smile, she added, "You know, if you lived with us, you could join the debate team at your new school. They're state champions." I felt my heart clench. "Mama," my voice wavered. "Just think about it, okay?" she said, squeezing my hand. "We want you home. With us." I watched her walk away, feeling like I was being torn apart. What did that even mean, home? Where was home? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my mother and her perfect new life with Alvise. Thinking about my father, working himself to exhaustion just to give me everything I needed. I was 14, and the weight of the world felt unbearable. How could I choose? How could I make a decision that wouldn't break someone's heart? My 15th birthday was approaching, but instead of excitement, I felt only fear. My mother and father were arguing over who would throw the party. It all came to a head during one of our family dinners at my father's house. "She's been living with me for years," Paula growled, stabbing her fork into her steak. "Of course, I'm throwing the party." My mother's eyes flashed. "She's my daughter, Luigi. I have the right to celebrate her birthday." I sat there, pushing peas around my plate, wishing I could disappear. And then, suddenly, my mother said, "Marietta," her voice softened. "You're old enough now to decide where you want to live." The room fell silent. I felt their eyes on me, my mother's, full of hope, my father's, full of pain, Alvise, waiting. I couldn't breathe. "I want to live with Mom," I whispered. The look on my father's face. God. Like I had just driven a knife straight into his heart. Before I even realized what was happening, I was packing my things. My mother and Alvise were glowing, helping me move my suitcases into their house. And my father. My father just stood in the doorway. His eyes were empty. You can come back anytime, Pumpkin, he said as I left. Anytime. The first few weeks at my mother's and Elvi's felt like a dream. We went shopping for my new room. I was allowed to pick out an insanely expensive bed and furniture. I was enrolled at Westfield Academy, a private school. You'll get a first-class education here, my mother beamed. This is the start of your bright future, Marietta. And the family game nights. Oh, those were great. We played Monopoly in concept, laughing and bickering like a real family. I thought I had made the right choice. But then, things started to change. At first, it was little things. Sweetheart, are you sure you want to wear that? My mother wrinkled her nose. It's not really flattering on you. Or, you know, Marky always looks so polished. Maybe you could try styling your hair like hers. Then it was my grades. Westfield was harder than my old school, and I was trying my best, but a B-, Marietta. My mother frowned at my report card. You know, Marky was the top of her class. Maybe you're just not putting in enough effort. Game nights became less frequent. I'd come home to find a note on the fridge. We're at the Petersons. Dinner's in the fridge, don't wait up. I'd heat up my dinner and eat alone. Stare at my new, perfectly curated decor. And suddenly, it felt cold. Foreign. The final straw was the vacation. They had promised me this amazing trip to Hawaii. I had been so excited, counting down the days, dreaming of the sun, the ocean, long lazy afternoons on the beach. And then, 2 weeks before we were supposed to leave, Alvise sat me down across from him. Listen, kid, he wouldn't look me in the eye, just stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. We're gonna have to postpone the trip. Just some financial stuff we need to sort out. You understand, right? I nodded. Smiled, like it was no big deal. But inside, something cracked. That night, I lay in my fancy new bed in my fancy new room, in this house that was supposed to be home, and cried. I cried for the life I had left behind. For my father, who was probably sitting alone in our big, empty house. For the little girl who once believed she could have everything. The days leading up to the final custody hearing were tense. My mother smiled, reassured me that everything would be fine. But there was an uneasiness in the air, thick enough to feel. We tiptoed around each other. Pretended everything was perfect. I couldn't sleep. The pressure of the upcoming hearing, the anxious, pulling feeling in my chest, it all swirled in my head, keeping me awake night after night. And then, a week before the trial, it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, my throat dry as sandpaper. The house was silent. Everyone was asleep. I crept downstairs for some water, barefoot on the steps, when I heard voices. My mother and Elvise. Arguing. I froze in the darkness. I'm tired of pretending I enjoy having her around. Elvise's voice was sharp, irritated. That kid is draining our resources. My heart clenched. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath. I know, my mother's voice was low but firm. But think about the tax benefits and the child support. Once we get full custody, we'll have a steady source of income from Luigi. It felt like a punch to the gut. I just hope it's worth it, Elvise scoffed. I didn't sign up to be a full-time dad to a teenager. It's just a little longer, my mother reassured him. Once she's officially ours, we'll be able to set stricter rules. Maybe, even send her to boarding school. I didn't wait. I spun around and rushed back to my room. The water was forgotten. I dove under my blanket, gripping the fabric so tightly my knuckles turned white. Tears streamed down my face. It was all a lie. The shopping trips. The expensive school. The family game nights. They didn't want me. They wanted my father's money. I barely slept that night, replaying their words in my head over and over again. In the morning, I went downstairs, feeling like a zombie. "Good morning, sweetheart," my mother chirped as if nothing had happened. "Ready for breakfast?" I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. I picked at my cereal, unable to taste anything. "Are you okay, Marietta?" Alvise peered at me over his newspaper. "You look pale." I forced a smile. "Just nervous about a test," I lied. They exchanged glances. "Well, don't worry too much," my mother patted my hand. "I'm sure you'll do great." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table over. I wanted to throw my plate at them, to say everything, to make them understand that I knew. To make them explain how they could do this to me. But I did nothing. I just sat there. Nodded. Smiled. Played the role of the perfect daughter. As soon as breakfast was over, I went back to my room. I sat on my bed, wrapping my arms around myself, staring at the expensive furniture, the perfectly chosen curtains, the plush carpet. I had once been so happy about all of it. Now these walls felt like a prison. What was I going to do? The hearing was in a week. If I stayed silent, they would keep me here, with people who saw me as nothing more than a financial deal. I couldn't let that happen. The day of the custody hearing came like a clap of thunder. The courtroom was packed. My mother and Alvise sat on one side, confident, composed. Across from them, my father, with my grandparents beside him. He looked exhausted, as if he had already accepted defeat. The lawyers droned on, presenting their arguments. I sat in silence, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles went white. I could feel their eyes on me. Their expectations. Finally, the judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, turned to me. "Marietta," her voice was surprisingly gentle. "You're old enough for your opinion to matter. Who do you want to live with?" The room fell still. I felt my mother's triumphant smile, her certainty. Her victory. My father looked broken, like a man bracing for the final blow. I stood up. My legs trembled. I was afraid I might fall. A deep breath. "I want to live with my father," I said. My voice shook at first, but with each word, it grew steadier. "And I don't want to see my mother ever again." The shock rippled through the courtroom like an electric jolt. My mother's smile vanished. Alvise's face went pale. My father stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. The judge frowned, leaning forward. "Marietta, that's a very serious statement. Can you explain why?" I nodded. Swallowed hard. A week ago, I overheard a conversation between my mother and Alvise. I took a deep breath, gathering my strength. They said they were only fighting for custody because of the money. Because of the child support. The tax benefits. They said they would send me to boarding school as soon as they got custody. They don't actually want me. I watched as the color slowly drained from my mother's face. Alvise wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the floor. "That's not true," my mother's voice was sharp, almost shrill. "Marietta, sweetheart, you misunderstood." "Mrs. Parker, please," the judge cut her off sharply. She turned to me, her gaze both kind and searching. "Marietta, are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" I nodded. Tears stung my eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm sure." The judge gave a slow nod, then turned back to the courtroom. "In light of this new information, we need to take a short recess. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. People began to file out. I finally dared to look at my father. His eyes were wide, filled with shock and something else. Hope, maybe. I wanted to run to him, to hug him, to tell him how sorry I was. But before I could move, a court officer led me out of the room. Those 30 minutes stretched into eternity. I sat alone in a separate room, wrapping my arms around myself, trying not to think about my mother's face, her voice filled with panic. Trying not to think about how I felt when my father looked at me. But the thoughts wouldn't let go. Finally, we were called back into the courtroom. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would burst from my chest. The judge cleared her throat. The room fell silent. In light of the new information provided by Marietta, and after careful consideration of all factors, I have reached a decision. She paused for a moment. Custody is awarded to the father, Luigi Thompson. For a second, the room was completely still. And then my mother gasped. I looked at her. She sat there as if struck by lightning, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. Alvise slumped back in his chair as if he had been hit. And my father. My father exhaled, like he had been holding his breath this entire time. Furthermore, the judge continued, Paula Parker will be required to pay child support. The relief that crashed over me was overwhelming. I turned to my father, and for the first time in years, I saw him truly smile. As we were leaving the courthouse, my mother grabbed my arm. Her face was twisted with rage and pain. I never loved you, she hissed. You're just as stupid as your father. Her words hit like a slap. But as I watched her walk away with Alvise, I realized I was free. Free from the lies. Free from the manipulation. Free from the constant feeling that I wasn't good enough. The next few years were, well, they weren't easy. But they were healing. My father and I started going to family therapy. At first, it was awkward and painful, bringing all our resentment, misunderstandings, and regrets to the surface. But little by little, session after session, we started rebuilding our relationship. We learned to listen to each other. We learned to forgive. And our bond became stronger than ever. My grandparents became my rock. They were always there, with warm hugs, home-cooked meals, and a patient willingness to listen. Their unwavering support helped me believe in family again. I threw myself into school and extracurricular activities. On a whim, I joined the debate team, and, to my surprise, discovered I had a talent for public speaking. Standing at the podium, expressing my thoughts, arguing, proving my point, I felt stronger than ever. Like I had finally found my voice. For my 18th birthday, my dad had a surprise for me. When I opened the box, I lost my breath. It was a photo album. An album filled with pictures and memories from my childhood. There were photos I thought had been lost during the divorce. Me and my mom at the beach. My first day of kindergarten. Christmas. Birthdays. And just simple, everyday moments that had suddenly become priceless. I couldn't hold back my tears. Now I'm 20. I'm in college, studying psychology. My experience has inspired me to help children going through divorce. I want them to know they're not alone. It's not their fault. They can survive. And even thrive. I still carry scars from what happened. There are days when the pain of my mother's betrayal feels fresh, when I find myself wondering, again and again, how she could do that to me. But I'm learning to turn that pain into strength. I've started speaking at conferences about children's rights in divorce cases. I share my story, hoping that it might make a difference. Maybe, if even one judge, one lawyer, or one parent hears me and thinks twice before using a child as a pawn, it will all be worth it. My dad comes to every one of my speeches. He sits in the front row, beaming with pride. Sometimes, I see him wipe away a tear when I talk about how far we've come. As for my mother, I haven't spoken to her since that day in court. Sometimes, I think about reaching out. But I'm not ready. Maybe someday. But not now. Right now, I'm focused on healing. On the future. On becoming the person I want to be. Life isn't perfect. I still have trust issues. I still struggle with self-doubt. But I'm learning. Growing. Healing. And most importantly, I'm surrounded by people who love me for who I am. Not for who they want me to be. Let me know what you think of this story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. See you soon.